Ramones were one of those truly revolutionary bands in music history. They stripped rock to its roots and defined a new genre. They showed musicians what music could be like if they did it their own way and didn't cave to the mainstream entities. This is Sound of History, and this is the Ramones. Jeffrey Hyman was born in 1951 in Queens. He was born with an improperly formed twin growing on his back, which was surgically removed. I don't know why that's relevant, but it's here, so I said it. He attended Forest Hills High School in Queens, where he would eventually meet the other members of the Ramones.
Hold on. I have more questions about the twin.
Well, I don't have any answers.
Was it like conjoined, but dead?
I think so, yeah.
That's sad.
He was a decent student, but was an outcast in school. As a teenager, he was diagnosed with OCD and schizophrenia.
I feel like there has to be, back then to be diagnosed with schizophrenia that early, I feel like there were some pretty strong signs.
For most of his teenage years, he played the drums because he idolized Keith Moon, before switching to guitar at 17. In 1972, Jeffrey started to play in a glam punk band called Sniper, under the stage name Jeff Starship. He initially started to love music because it gave him an escape from the mess of his parents' divorce. His mother remarried, but his stepfather died in a car accident. He was eventually replaced in Sniper, so he started a new band with two of his friends, Douglas Colvin and John Cummings, and he joined as the drummer. At the time, Douglas was already going by the stage name D.D. Ramone, taken from a stage name that Paul McCartney used briefly when the Silver Beatles toured Scotland. So the other two guys also took Ramone as their surname and called their band Ramones. So Jeffrey Hyman, also known as Jeff Starship,
Also known as Jeff Ramone.
No, he forever became known as Joey Ramone. Douglas Colvin was born in 1951 in Virginia. His father was an American soldier, and his mother was a German woman that he presumably met during World War II. His father's military service required them to move frequently. They lived in West Berlin for a while when Douglas was a kid. Because of the frequent moves, he was pretty lonely and rarely had any good close friends. When his parents separated, he stayed in Berlin with his mom until he was 15. Then he moved with his mother and his sister to Forest Hills in Queens to escape his alcoholic father. In Forest Hills, he met John Cummings and Thomas, Erdely, who were playing in a band called Tangerine Puppets.
I like that name.
Douglas met John in a building where Douglas worked in the mailroom and John was working on construction for the building. Douglas and John immediately became good friends because they were both social outcasts, and one day they agreed to both cash their paychecks and buy musical instruments. After John auditioned to join the band Television and was rejected, he suggested Douglas and their new friend Jeffrey start a band. Originally, Douglas, or Dee, was the singer, but he quickly learned that his voice couldn't handle it without getting shredded. So Jeffrey, or Joey Ramone, took over the vocal duties. So Joey originally joined as a drummer and then couldn't play drums and sing at the same time. So now they need a drummer. So they apparently started the band only about a week after Johnny and Douglas bought their instruments. So that's how Dee Ramone, who had the reputation for being the wildest member of the group, got started with his musical journey. After he relinquished vocal duties, he still played bass and served as the principal songwriter for the group. He also always started their songs with his signature 1, 2, 3, 4 call. So Johnny was born in 1948 in Queens as the only son of a very strict construction worker. So Johnny said, quote, "My father would get on these tangents about how he never missed a day's work. I broke my big toe the day I had to go pitch a Little League game, and he's going, 'What are you, a baby? What did I do, raise a baby? You go play.'
Toxic masculinity at its finest.
And even though my toe was broken, I had to go pitch the game anyway. It was terrible," end quote.
I really feel like all of these children just need a hug.
But instead, they got punk. While working various odd jobs, he met and became friends with Dee. They'd often have lunch together and talk about their love of music, particularly a band called the Stooges. So this was at a very low point in Johnny's life. After the Tangerine Puppets broke up, he was kind of directionless and became scary even to himself. He would throw televisions off of rooftops near people. He would throw bricks through windows, just like angry kid lashing out type of stuff. The whole time, Thomas kept encouraging him to make more music, but he didn't. Then he had a moment of awakening. We haven't really talked about Thomas much, but he's the guy with the funky last name from earlier. So this is Johnny's moment of awakening. He said, quote, "Then all of a sudden, one day everything changed. I was 20. I was walking down the block near my neighborhood, and I heard a voice. I don't know what it was. God, maybe. It asked, quote, 'What are you doing with your life? Is this what you are here for?' It was a spiritual awakening, and I just immediately stopped everything. It was all clear-cut right then."
Aww.
End quote. In 1973, he officially joined with Dee Dee and Jeffrey/Joey to become the Ramones. Douglas became Dee Dee Ramone and played bass. Jeffrey became Joey Ramone on drums, and Johnny became Johnny Ramone on guitar. Dee Dee eventually stopped singing, and Joey took over, which meant they needed a new drummer. At the time, Johnny's former bandmate, Thomas Erdelyi, or however you said it, was serving as the group's manager. When they did auditions for a new drummer, Thomas would often sit at the drums to demonstrate how the songs should be played.
Oh, sweet babies.
They all quickly realized that Thomas was a better drummer than anyone that they had auditioned, so Thomas became Tommy Ramone and joined the group. A friend of theirs got them time in a rehearsal studio in New York City so that they could practice. Thomas Erdelyi was born in 1949 in Budapest, Hungary. His family survived the Holocaust by being hidden by neighbors. In 1957, his family fled Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution and settled in Forest Hills, Queens. After graduating high school, he got a job at Record Plant Studio as an assistant engineer. Through that job, he worked on one of Jimi Hendrix's albums. Then when his old friend Johnny, who Thomas always encouraged to keep doing music, suggested starting a band, Thomas stepped in as manager. Thomas said about those early days of trying to figure out what the Ramones even were, quote, "What we were doing was almost like a concept. I realized that what you needed wasn't musicianship. What you needed was ideas. Anything that worked, we kept," end quote. They played their first concert as the Ramones on March 30th, 1974 at Performance Studios in Manhattan. Their songs were all super fast and super short, none of them longer than 2 minutes. Someone who saw that early show said, quote, "Oh my God, they were raw. The Ramones were so bad. Forget about it. It was painful."
That's
end
funny.
Quote. In these early days, they developed their trademarks. Tommy played drums like a guitarist. He said he locked on to Johnny's guitar playing and just copied that with the drums. Johnny played his guitar in a chainsaw style with all downstrokes. Joey sang in a strange kind of yelp. At the end of their first show, Dee Dee stood on the neck of his bass and broke it, which is not what you want to do when you are broke.
Oh my God.
In August of 1974, they got their first break into the scene when they were allowed to play at CBGBs. A lot of bands saw CBGB as like a rehearsal space. Mark Bell, who was a drummer, saw some of the early shows that the Ramones played there, and he said, quote, "They weren't fully developed image-wise. John and Joey were in satin pants, and Dee Dee had these shirts with the collar buttoned high. The next time I saw them, they were in brand new leather jackets. They were sloppy, they had to stop songs and go back to recount the intro. They'd argue about songs, but that's just how it was. We were there to hone our skills." End quote. Their first set that they played at CBGB lasted 17 minutes. And the owner said about their show, quote, "They were the most untogether band I'd ever heard. They kept starting and stopping, equipment breaking down and yelling at each other. But they turned out to be a good draw for some reason, so he kept having them back."
Yeah, because it's a show.
Yeah.
You never know what they're going to do.
Yeah. The Ramones had this idea to have one new song every time that they met to practice. So by early 1975, along with establishing their image and kind of figuring out their sound a little bit more, they also had a rather large repertoire of original music. By the middle of 1975, they had earned a residency at CBGB, and people started to take a little bit more notice of their sets. A few of the rock record labels were even coming down to see them. In late 1975, Sire Records signed them to a recording contract. They originally offered a singles deal. They'd make a few songs as part of a New York's Finest compilation kind of thing, but the Ramones manager said that he could make an album for the same amount of money as a single. He said, quote, "Seymour wanted to make 2 singles, but I said I could make a whole album for the same cost. What's the point in setting up the Ramones for 5 songs when you can get an album? There had been inklings in the British press that something was happening in New York, and Sire felt that if we could make a cheap album and get our money back in Europe, it wasn't a risky proposition. The band spent a week in Plaza Sound Studios, which was a wide-open space above Radio City Music Hall.
A week.
They had 4 days to record and a week to master the recordings. In terms of the money pouring into the industry at the time, the album cost basically nothing to record. It actually used very top-of-the-line equipment, but the recording sounded super raw, which was done on purpose by the producer. It took a while for the album to catch on, but once it did, the album became iconic, both in punk and in the world. The album essentially defined what punk rock was. Dee Dee did most of the songwriting on the album, and most of the songs were under 2.5 minutes long. Critics immediately loved the album, while Rolling Stone, when it came out, said, quote, "It is constructed almost entirely of rhythm tracks of an exhilarating intensity rock and roll has not experienced since its earliest days," end quote. Despite the good critic reviews, it was not a commercial success.
That is just so funny.
It only reached 111 on the charts, but the legacy that it had was immense. The producer said that he understood that later when massive bands like Soundgarden and Green Day started talking about how influential that album was for them. After this album, the band started to play outside of New York for the first time. They played in Ohio for their first show out of New York City and met members of other prominent punk bands.
Why Ohio?
I don't know. But their tour of England in 1976 really showed their potential. They played a few club dates and met members of the Sex Pistols and The Clash. Their performances really exhilarated the burgeoning punk scene in the UK. The Ramones also weren't afraid to give out advice to the up-and-coming punk bands that they met along the way.
I'm sure that they weren't.
They gave advice to The Clash and the Sex Pistols while they were in England. Johnny Ramone said, quote, "We weren't against anybody. I thought the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Clash were all going to become the major groups, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and it would be a better world," end quote. But then later, Johnny Ramone started to get a little bit annoyed with the Sex Pistols' antics. They started to curse on live television, inspire riots, spit on reporters, and all of that culminated in Sid Vicious, their bassist, getting arrested for allegedly murdering his girlfriend.
3 of those things are much worse than one of them.
But all of those antics did serious damage to the punk image. Instead of being revolutionary and inspirational, the Sex Pistols made it evil and reprehensible to the general public. The Ramones released their next 2 albums in 1977. Their second album, which was called Leave Home, performed even worse than their first one.
Aww.
Their third album, called Rocket to Russia, reached number 49 on the charts and became their highest charting album, I think, of all time. The band toured steadily, playing over 150 nights a year. They weren't a big band, so they didn't have a bus. They'd travel hours to shows in a small van packed together. This, along with exhaustion, led to quite a few fights.
Well, it sounds like they were fighting from the very beginning.
Yeah. All of it started to get a little bit too much for Tommy, who was the manager turned drummer.
Yeah.
Once in an LA hotel, Johnny yelled at him and said that the Ramones were his band, not Tommy's. According to Tommy, the others always feared that Tommy would for some reason try to take over the band, which he had absolutely no intention of doing. In 1978, Tommy played his last show with the Ramones at CBGB. He stayed on as their producer for the next album, and they got Mark Bell, who went by Marky Ramone, to replace him. Marky was the drummer for one of the founding punk bands called Richard Hell and the Voidoids. So he fit in with the sound and the aesthetic of this punk scene that they were already doing. This band change also sparked a change in their style. Their next album, Road to Ruin, featured some new instruments for them, like acoustic guitar.
Wow.
And they even sang some ballads, and it featured their first songs over 2 minutes long.
Wow.
The album wasn't a commercial success, but it featured one of their best-known songs, called I Wanna Be Sedated. After they appeared in a movie for the first time, called Rock and Roll High School in 1979.
That sounds god-awful, and I want to watch it.
Legendary producer Phil Spector became interested in them. He produced their next album in 1980, and there's a long-standing rumor that he held Johnny Ramone at gunpoint in the studio and forced him to play a guitar riff over and over until he got it right. But the album would become their highest charting album, but Johnny didn't like it. He said it was watered-down Ramones, and he preferred their harder, more aggressive stuff. Johnny was the de facto leader of the band, even though many people thought that it was Joey. Joey was the one up front singing and all that kind of stuff, but Johnny ruled the band with an iron fist. He'd issue fines if members were late or too drunk.
That's so dumb.
He would yell and slap people. Marky, who's the new drummer, has said that they regularly heard Johnny yelling at and slapping his girlfriend in the hotel. Someone said, quote, Dee Dee was terrified of Johnny because Johnny would punch him in the face.
Okay,
It would always be after the show about something like, you did a B major when you should have done a C minor.
Oh my God, arrest this man.
I'd stand outside the dressing room. Inside, you'd hear glass shattering and bodies slamming into walls.
Why are you outside the dressing room?
Joey started seriously dating... This is Joey, the singer, not Johnny, the jerk. It gets confusing, so I'm trying to clarify that.
Yeah.
Joey started seriously dating a girl named Linda, and she would come with them on tour sometimes. So the others would notice that Johnny and Linda, Joey's girlfriend, started flirting and would disappear for times together. The band tried to tell Joey, but he just wouldn't listen. He was too loyal. Soon, Linda left Joey, and Johnny left his girlfriend, and they started living together in Manhattan. They didn't tell Joey because Johnny was afraid he'd leave the band if he found out. Eventually, Johnny and Linda would get married. Joey never got over that relationship. He was in love with Linda, and you could hear the heartbreak in the songs that he wrote, like, "The KKK took my baby away."
Oh my God.
And he started to drink heavily, and he developed a cocaine addiction. He later said, quote, Johnny crossed the line. He destroyed the relationship and the band right there, end quote. But he didn't leave the band. Meanwhile, they released their sixth album in 1981, which continued the trend of taking them farther from the traditional punk roots. Johnny always maintained that was a label decision to try and turn them radio-friendly. Their direction now was more heavy metal than punk. The next album, in 1983, brought them back to the harder punk style. And after that album, Marky was fired due to his alcoholism. He was replaced by Richie Ramone, who, according to Joey, put the soul back into the Ramones. We're not going to really talk about... There's several lineup changes. We're not really going to talk about the new guys. They're there, then they're not.
Aren't we all?
They released their first album with Richie in 1984, and Tommy came back to produce it. It was a return to their traditional sound.
Go, Tommy.
But pretty quickly, Richie had financial conflicts with Johnny, and he left the band. He was briefly replaced by the drummer of Blondie, but that was a disaster, and he was fired after 2 shows.
Wow.
So Marky, who is now sober, rejoined the group. They were set to release their 11th studio album and make it their big comeback. But by this point, Dee Dee was really tired of the band. So Dee Dee was really tired of the band and clearly indicated that he wanted to leave. He'd show up with spiky hair and gold chains, just kind of breaking the aesthetic that they set.
I'm here for it. Hell yeah. Dee Dee is like a fashion icon.
Yeah. He'd say that his new passion in life was to be a rap star.
Oh.
He'd also had a messed up life, but he had been dependent on hard drugs since he was a kid. He'd mix his bipolar medication with cocaine.
Uh-huh.
He actually made good on his promise and released a kind of rap album in 1988 under the name Dee Dee King. It failed in every possible way that it could fail. Okay. And one critic called it one of the worst recordings of all time. Well, for the next album, Dee Dee didn't record bass, and he only showed up to do backing vocals. In 1989, he left the band, which caught the others completely off guard.
Why?
Somehow. He went on to start a few other punk bands that were similar to the Ramones, and he'd sometimes write for the Ramones, but he never rejoined the band. The band stayed together, hanging on by threads. Joey and Johnny's partnership fueled the band. They were the only 2 original members left at this point. But they didn't really like each other at all.
That doesn't sound like it would work.
They were politically at odds. Johnny was a deep conservative, and Joey was a hardcore liberal. In 1992, they moved to a new label for the first time in their career and released a new album that was supposed to be a big comeback after years of decline. In 1995, the band announced that they'd be disbanding. They released one final album called Adios Amigo and did a farewell tour at the end of 1995. Johnny set their last show for August 6, 1996 in Los Angeles. They were asked to play a big show in Argentina that everyone wanted to do, but Joey said that he couldn't because of health reasons. That really pissed off Johnny, who thought he was just being dramatic, so he decided to end the band. Johnny said, quote, "I said nothing to the other guys. I just walked out. It was the way I lived my life. Of course, I was really feeling loss of some sort. I just didn't want to admit it." End quote. Well, it turns out that Joey had a pretty good reason to not want to go to Argentina.
I'm sure he did.
He had lymphoma in his bone marrow.
Oh.
Because of the treatment, he could barely get the stamina to even perform. But he also didn't feel comfortable confiding this information with his bandmates. On July 20th, 1999, Joey, Johnny, Dee Dee, and Tommy, the original four, appeared together for an autograph signing. A couple of the later band members were also there, but that was the last time that the original four members of the group appeared together. Even through his sickness and treatment, Joey found time to write and record a solo album. Joey suffered from OCD, which caused him to hear voices when he didn't do something exactly right. In the early hours of December 31st, he heard voices and thought that he had not closed his chiropractor's door correctly, so he went to do that. He was walking the streets when he fell and broke his hip. The subsequent surgery meant that his cancer treatments had to be paused, and his condition steadily worsened. Marky, the replacement drummer, was the only one who visited him in the hospital. Marky called Johnny and said that he had to visit. The window was closing. "Let it close," replied Johnny.
What?
"He's not my friend."
Oh my God.
On April 15th, 2001, family and friends gathered to his bedside. The doctor turned off the respirator. His brother Mickey played a U2 song that Joey really loved, and by the end of the song, Joey had passed away. He was only 49. Only Tommy, Richie, and a later guy that we didn't talk about were the only Ramones to attend his funeral. A few years later, when asked if he went to the funeral, Johnny said, quote, "I was in California. I wasn't going to travel all the way to New York, but I wouldn't have gone anyway. I wouldn't want him coming to my funeral, and I wouldn't want to hear from him if I were dying.
What an awful person.
I'd only want to see my friends. Let me die and leave me alone."
What
End quote.
an actual awful person.
Yeah, but it sounds like that might have been a little bit for show, and he really did miss Joey and regret that he never reconnected with him. But he did say later, quote, "I'm not doing anything without Joey. I felt that was it. He was my partner, me and him. I miss that." End quote. In 2002, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, specifically Johnny, Joey, Dee Dee, Tommy, and Marky. During the induction speech, Johnny thanked the normal people, the managers and promoters and all that stuff, along with President Bush and America. Marky thanked a lot of his earlier influences, people who were like in the room, like other musicians and stuff. Dee Dee only thanked and congratulated himself. Tommy was the only one who even mentioned Joey. 11 weeks after that ceremony, Dee Dee was found dead of a heroin overdose.
Tracks.
He had tried to stay sober on and off through the years, but he fell off the wagon at the end. In 1994, Dee Dee met a 16-year-old named Barbara in Argentina.
Don't do this, Dee Dee.
They would eventually get married and stay married until Dee Dee's death. She was the one who found him in his home in Hollywood. He had a small funeral, and the inscription on his tombstone read, quote, "Okay, I gotta go now." Johnny, after the breakup, wrote a memoir and acted in a couple of different things, but he was also in the midst of his own health crisis. In the late 90s, Johnny had started having trouble urinating. He learned that he had prostate cancer, and it kept spreading. In 2004, the doctors told Linda, Joey's ex and Johnny's wife, that her husband was going to die. He wrote his autobiography in the midst of his cancer, and I think because he realized that he would probably die, he was super candid and open in it. He wrote, quote, "I carried around fury and intensity during my career. I had an image, and that image was anger. I was the one who was scowling, downcast, and I tried to make sure I looked like that when I was getting my picture taken. The Ramones were what I was, and so I was that person so many people saw on that stage. While retirement seemed to soften me, the prostate cancer I was diagnosed with in 1997 did so even more. It changed me, and I don't know that I like how. It has softened me up, and I like the old me better. I don't even have the energy to be angry." Johnny Ramone passed away on September 15th, 2004, at the age of 55. Johnny gave up drinking before starting the Ramones, and he never did any drugs stronger than pot. So his death was super surprising to quite a lot of people. Tommy Ramone started a bluegrass duo with his longtime girlfriend called Uncle Monk, and quietly played in that band for about 10 years, until he passed away on July 11th, 2014, from cancer of the bile duct. For a lot of people, the Ramones are punk music. Their debut album is said to be one of the first albums in history that changed popular music forever. They created the blueprint for punk music for the next 20 years at least. In a lot of ways, they were instrumental to the indie music scene as well as the popular music scene. It's almost impossible to find a punk, hardcore, metal, or alternative rock band that wasn't influenced by them. Towards the end, they had always hoped there would be a reunion. When Marky visited Joey in the hospital, they even talked about it. Even Johnny was thinking about it. But when Joey died, so did the Ramones. Johnny never even considered doing anything Ramones related without him. He said, quote, "In my head, it was never officially over until Joey died. There was no more Ramones without Joey. He was irreplaceable. No matter what a pain he was actually the most difficult person I have ever dealt with in my life. I didn't want him to die, though. I wouldn't have wanted to play without him, no matter how I felt about him. We were in it together. So when it happened, I was sad about the end of the Ramones. I thought I wouldn't care, and I did. So it was weird. I guess all of a sudden, I did miss him." End quote. So I'll leave this very long episode with something that Joey said in 1999 after their breakup. He had this to say about the legacy of the Ramones. Quote, "The Ramones were and are a great band. When we went out there to play, the power was intense, like going to see The Who in the 60s. When I put the Ramones on the stereo now, we still sound great. And that will always be there. When you need a lift, when you need a fix." End quote. All right, that's the Ramones.